How do you tolerate other people's negative reactions to your boundaries? Now, there's no universal or easy answer here. It's layered, and the specifics will depend on what the boundary is, who the other person is, and your relationship to them, among other things. So I'm not going to try to provide a one-size-fits-all response because honestly, there is no such thing. Instead, I'll share 3 principles that you can thoughtfully consider and apply to the specifics of your situation. If you have specific questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. So the first principle is to recognize that change is uncomfortable. The other person has become accustomed to what you've been doing, as have you. So when you do something different, it's disruptive. It's only natural that the other person would react differently, but this doesn't mean that your boundary is wrong. It just means the system, in this case, the relationship, is responding to something new. So for example, if you have historically been available to your team at all hours of the day or night, when you set a boundary that you won't respond to work emails after 8 p.m., your team will likely have a reaction, not because the boundary is a problem, but simply because the system, in this case your team, needs to adapt, and this can take some time. Now, the more you can prepare your team for the change by forecasting it and adjusting workflows and expectations accordingly, the less intense this reaction might be. The second principle is to remember that the other person's feelings about your boundary have no bearing on the legitimacy of the boundary itself. Let me say that again. The other person's feelings about your boundary have no bearing on the legitimacy of the boundary itself. Let me give you an example. When my 4-year-old has a tantrum because I tell her she can't have a lollipop for breakfast, her disappointment and anger about the boundary doesn't mean something is wrong with the boundary. It just means she doesn't like it. It also doesn't mean something is wrong with me. Setting a boundary that doesn't feel fair to the other person doesn't mean you aren't a fair person. Setting a boundary that doesn't feel reasonable to the other person doesn't mean the boundary is unreasonable. So my daughter might feel that the no lollipops for breakfast boundary is unfair, but that doesn't mean I'm an unfair or an inconsiderate parent. The issue here is that how somebody feels about your boundary is not necessarily an accurate read on your character or the legitimacy of the intention in setting the boundary. So finally, number 3. Allow yourself the flexibility to experiment with boundary setting. If you're new to the concept of boundaries, or you're in a new situation or a new relationship where you're trying to implement boundaries, this is messy stuff. No one comes out of the gate knowing exactly what boundary is going to work best, especially in gray areas. Now, the point is you have to start somewhere and allow yourself to see what happens and then adapt accordingly. Now, to be clear, there are some boundaries that I would argue are non-negotiable, such as not tolerating abuse and, in my house, not having lollipops for breakfast. So I'm talking about those gray areas, like setting a time for when you stop responding to work emails. For me, it could be 6 p.m. For you, it could be 10 p.m. Both could be equally valid and legitimate. It would depend on our specific circumstances and what our needs and what our team needs are at a given time. The main point here is that you don't have to get it right the first time. If someone reacts strongly to a boundary, don't automatically assume that the boundary is the problem. Give yourself some time to consider their reaction, and as you collect data about whether the boundary is helping or not, you always have the right to make adjustments. Boundary setting is a lot of work. But in the process, if you approach it with curiosity and connection to your values and yourself, you are going to learn so much about what works and what doesn't work and why. And all of this helps you clarify your values and priorities so that the boundary setting process in the future becomes easier because you have a greater internal sense of confidence and the data to support it. Let me know if this was helpful for you in the comments, and subscribe for more videos to help manage people pleasing and perfectionism.